Hi everyone, my name is Sherell, and today in my presentation, I will be investigating how media coverage of shootings may desensitize people to aggression. So, for the past year, there have been over 8 school shootings. This resulted in deaths, injuries, some totaling over 229 incidents in 2018, and that was according to an analyst by the Education Week. And that's not counting the many shootings that has caused no casualties. Anyone who spends time online knows that violent news has become a normal point of everyday scrolling. This project focuses on how repeated exposure to shooting related media affects the emotions, thinking, and attitudes of young adults in today's digital world. Everyday exposure across platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok. Just by opening your phone today often means coming across violent headlines or clips, even when you're not looking for them. For example, shooting stories spread quickly across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, which make this type of content almost impossible to avoid. So as you see here on the news, there has been many mass shootings, and this one was in Texas. Apparently, shooting-related headlines can appear back-to-back across different platforms. Even when people are actively searching for them, you can't really avoid it. This is because the digital algorithm pushes threatening violent stories to the front of everyone's feed, such as young adults end up seeing the same tragic events again and again. Because we're living in a digital world, young adults spend more time online than any other age group, which makes them the most exposed to constant news updates. As such, their emotional reactions are shaped by the unfiltered, repeated, and sometimes graphic nature of breaking news. The purpose of this project is to understand how repeated exposure to shooting related media affects emotions, aggressions, and in everyday life. In other words, I'm exploring whether constant violent news can slowly weaken emotional reactions and shift how many adults think about violence in today's society. In this presentation, I will attempt to walk through the main psychological theories, recent research, strengths and weaknesses in the evidence, and what all this means for young adults today. Each section will help explain why repeated exposure matters more than usually we realize. The project is grounded in 3 major theories: the general aggression model, desensitization theory, and cultivation theory. Together, they help explain how repeated exposure to shooting related media can slowly shape emotions, thoughts, and beliefs. The general aggression model, also go by GAM, apparently the general aggression model explains how many violent cues influence the way people think and feel during everyday situations. This theory shows why even short clips about shootings can activate strong emotional and cognitive reactions. Also, there's the violent cues and internal reaction. And according to the general aggression model, repeated exposure to violent content makes aggression thoughts easier to access during normal interactions. As such, young adults may react with irritation or emotional distance simply because these images are constantly in their feeds and they see it every day. When shooting related stories appear across several platforms, the model suggested that people begin forming behavioral script based on that exposure. So, in other words, aggressive or detached responses can start to feel familiar because the content never seems to stop. There's also the desensitization theory. This theory posits that emotional reactions weaken when people repeatedly encounter violent or distressing content. For example, something that once created shock or sadness may eventually feel normal after enough exposure. Emotional weakening over time. As you can see, as exposure continues, emotional intensity naturally drops because the mind adjusts to protect itself. As such, young adults may feel less empathy or concern when they come across the yet another shooting headline. Desensitization and real news footage. When violent news footage appear over and over, emotional reactions weaken even faster. In other words, the constant repetition makes tragic events feel strangely familiar, which is one of the biggest concerns in today's media environment. Cultivation theory explains how long-term media exposure shapes our beliefs about the world. For example, when violent news appears constantly, people may start believing that society is more dangerous than it actually is. Cultivation theory applied to shooting news. When shooting stories dominate the news cycle, the theory suggests that young adults may develop strong fears about crime and personal safety. As such, every exposure can shift their worldwide view. Even if their own communities are relatively safe, they may feel like they're still scared to go outside. Some literature review from 2021 to 2025 highlights four major themes: emotional reactions to violence, news, cognitive changes, desensitization patterns, and shifts in how people perceive crime and safety. Each theme explains the real life impact of repeated exposure to violent media. Theme 1: Emotional impact of violent news. So some suggest that exposure to distressing news content increases anxiety, sadness, and stress among young adults. For example, seeing multiple shooting stories in one day can create emotional overload and leave people feeling drained. And that was according to the Berlovkavia and Margraf 2022. Theme 2, the cognitive effects and aggressive thoughts. Sorry. So according to Health 2022, repeated exposure to violence media can make aggressive thoughts more accessible in everyday life. This simply means people may interpret situations through a more hostile lens after frequent reminders of violence. Team 3, the desensitization patterns. Repeated exposure to violent news can reduce emotional sensitivity, making people feel less shocked over time. As such, in young adults, they may become more emotionally numb after seeing the same types of tragedies again and again. And that's according to Bowman et al. 2021. According to Mancini and Bomi 2025, heavy exposure to violent news increases fear of crime, even in communities with low crime rates. In other words, what people see online can shape their safety beliefs more than what happens in their actual life. And that was theme 4, the perception of crime and safety. Theme 5, algorithmic amplification. Algorithm-driven feeds often resurface violent stories repeatedly based on what users have previously viewed. And that's according to the Pew Research Center 2023. As such, young adults, they may see the same shooting-related content across several platforms, even when they are trying to see something else, they just can't avoid it because the algorithm pushes those stuff because of their recent views. Literature synthesis. In short, the theme across recent research shows consistent emotional, cognitive, and perceptual effects linked to violent news exposure. Repeated exposure can increase stress, strengthen aggressive thinking, and alter how people judge safety in everyday life. So the strength of the research. According to Herman et al. 2023, one strength of this research area is that many studies are grounded in well-established psychological theories. According to several findings, they are supported across different age groups and culture, which give the evidence as much stronger foundation. Weaknesses of the research. So one of the clearest weaknesses that I found in the research studies, they relied heavily on self-report data, which can affect accuracy. So according to Mancini and Bomi 2025, emotional and cognitive reaction are often hard to measure through surveys alone, which limits how precise the findings really are. research gaps. According to Berlovskaya and Margraf 2022, one major gap is that most studies look at violence in general rather than shooting specific news exposure. Again, very few researchers have examined how social media algorithms intensify the exposure over time. What future research should explore? In my opinion, future research should take a closer look at how shooting related stories affect emotional reactions across weeks or months. According to Ritchie et al. 2025, long-term emotional patterns are still not fully understood, especially for young adults who scroll constantly on the net. So, application to everyday life, the impact on young adults. Young adults, they often feel emotionally exhausted after constant exposure to violent news. This simply means their daily scrolling can create a cycle of burnouts, stress, and worries even before the day starts. So, distressing news can increase anxiety and sadness, especially when viewed repeatedly. As such, young adults may find it harder to process tragedies because their minds never get a break from violent content. Repeated exposure to violent news can make people believe crime is rising even when local crime rates are stable. So, in other words, what young adults see online can shape their sense of safety more than what actually happens around them. Violent media exposure can make aggressive thoughts more accessible during everyday interactions. Constant reminders of shooting can increase irritability or make conflict focused reactions feel more automatic. Distressing news exposure increases stress and emotional fatigue, especially when viewed repeatedly. This simply means that constant violent headlines can slowly shape mental health patterns in young adults. Constant exposure to violent stories can increase polarization and reduce trust in communities. As such, people may isolate themselves more because the world appears more dangerous than it actually is. Media outlets influence how people perceive social problems by choosing which stories to highlight. Responsible reporting and clearer content warnings could help reduce the emotional strain linked to repeated violence. I think by giving someone the heads up to say this contains graphic content and view at your discretion, that will be a better alternative so you don't have to see something you don't want to see. Even though the research is strong in many areas, there are still important limitations we need to consider. For example, most studies focus on general media violence instead of shooting related news specifically, and many rely on self reported emotions rather than long term tracking, which shows more focused studies are still necessary. Conclusion. In conclusion, repeated exposure to shooting related news can shape emotions, thinking, and beliefs in powerful ways. To me, the topic matters because it affects how a whole generation understands violence, safety, and empathy. As such, recognizing these patterns can help us create healthier online habits and encourage media platforms to take more responsibility for the content young adults see every day. As you see in this video, kids are exposed to a lot of violence and they often want to repeat what they see. So I'd say limited exposure to violence in young adults is very important. Thank you.